Welcome back to The Offbit. This is a show where we use all the hardware to play today's games. If you haven't seen what we do on this show and you want to subscribe and join our friendly tech community, well, let us entice you. We can promise a channel where we take all the tech and push it to the test with the latest games. We show you how to mod your hardware for better performance. We can show you how to upgrade your system, and we will give you breakdowns of performance increases on those systems. We also value your comments, and we're here to give you help. So help us help you by subscribing. Now today we are looking at the Phenom 2 Black Edition again. We paired this CPU with the Gamewood GTX 660. We have a few games lined up and also have our standard synthetic benchmarks. So stick around and find out how we go. The AMD Phenom 2 955 Black Edition is a K10 CPU based on the Deneb core architecture. This CPU was released on April 23, 2009 and has been constructed on the 45nm manufacturing node. The AMD Phenom 2 955 Black Edition is a 4-core, 4-threaded CPU, clocked at 3.2 GHz with 6 MB of level 3 cache. This CPU has a TDP of 125 watts. The great thing about this CPU is that it's an AMD Black Edition CPU, meaning it has unlocked multipliers. This makes it a great CPU for overclocking. Today the motherboard we have is the GA-970-D3 revision 1.1 from Gigabyte. This motherboard is an AM3 Plus motherboard which supports not just the AMD Phenom 2 CPUs but has support for the AMD FX series as well. Based on the AMD 970 Northbridge chipset and paired with the AMD SB950 Southbridge, this motherboard comes with 4 DDR3 DIMM slots. Also has one 16 PCI slot running at 16 times and another X16 slot running at 4 times. It also has 3 lots of PCI 1X slots and supports AMD Crossfire X. The board has 8 USB 2.0 ports and 2 USB 3.0 ports on the back. It also has 6 audio jacks on the back. On the front it supports 6 USB 2.0 ports. The video card we're using today is the NVIDIA GTX 660 by Gamewood. The NVIDIA GTX 660 was released on September 13, 2012 and is from the Kepler architecture family. The GPU code for this GPU is GK106-400-A1 and is based off the 28nm fabrication node. Our card has 2GB of GDDR5 clocked at 1527 MHz on a 192-bit bus. GPU core is clocked at 1006 MHz and can boost up to 1072 MHz, and the card in total has a TDP of 140 watts. API support for the GTX 660 is DirectX 11 with functional DirectX 12 support, OpenCL 1.2, OpenGL 4.6, and it does support Vulkan 1.1. The DDR3 RAM we are using in this build today is from Corsair. This is the Corsair Vengeance Pro series. The model code for this RAM stick kit is CMY8GX3M2A1866C9R. This kit is basically 2 sticks of 4GB DDR3 RAM with clock supports up to 1866 MHz. Though our CPU will be limiting this RAM to 1600 MHz. Drives we're using today are a 120GB SSD Western Digital Green, a 240GB SSD Western Digital Green. We also have a 1TB magnetic Western Digital Green hard drive for some of the bigger games. Our operating system we are running today is Windows 10 Build 2004 and it has been installed on the 120GB SSD. Now we are all introduced to our hardware, let's see how the system goes with our synthetic benchmarks. First up, we ran the 955 Black Edition through 7-zip. In 7-zip, we scored a single score core of 3,295 points. Sitting behind the i5s and i7, but in front of the Core 2 Quad Q8400. Multi-core score, we scored 11,935 points. Interestingly enough, it beats the i5 760, which had a better single core, and this is a proper 4-core CPU as well. All in all, not sitting too bad. For 7-zip anyway. Moving on to CPID's CPU-Z benchmark test. The 955 Black Edition scored in single core mode 155.8 points. Its multi-core scored 619.6 points, pretty much sitting behind everything on this whole test. So whatever CPU Z is doing, this AMD Phenom 2 955 Black Edition is just not faring too well in this test. Moving on to Maxon Cinebench R15, the 955 Black Edition scored 323 points. Seeing us not too far behind the i5 760, which is a 4-core CPU, but in front of the i3 2120, which is only 2 cores and 4 threads. The CPU graph from Cinebench gives us confidence that this CPU should be able to run most games that we're going to throw at it today. Moving on to the GTX 660 from Gamewood, in Cinebench R15 we scored a 58.8 frames per second score. Pretty much sitting around the HD 5850s, in front of the HD 770 and in front of the HD 5770 on the i5 760. We generally find that Cinebench R15's GPU tests seem to favour AMD GPUs better than Nvidia. In Unigine Heaven, our Phenom 2 955 Black Edition of the GTX 660 from Gamewood scored us 841 points. This pushed us out in the lead, even beating the i5 760 with the GTX 660 overclock from Gigabyte. But this was only marginally. We also beat the GTX 750, so this is showing quite promising results for playing games. Our final test for the synthetics is 3D Mark's Firestrike. In Firestrike, the Phenom 2 955 Black Edition with the GTX 660 Gamewood scored us 4,247 points, sitting us second place behind the i5 760 with the GTX 660 overclock from Gigabyte. We thrashed the GTX 750 and pretty much everything else in the list, so looking very good for the GTX 660 playing games. Since we've introduced everything and we've looked at all the synthetics and we mentioned playing games, let's check our first game. First game up we're playing is Sea of Thieves. Sea of Thieves is a great action-adventure game by Rare. A very fun game to play with up to 4 of your best mates. Our build today gave us a little issues in Sea of Thieves. We ran Sea of Thieves at a resolution of 1920 by 1080 on low settings, or better known in the Sea of Thieves world as Cursed. This game really does stress the CPU on island load-ups. Something we did notice, however, is that the load lag that occurred when island loading was happening was actually quite short with the CPU, but yet still noticeable. To be honest, this system at these settings played quite well, and I'd be happy to play this game on this system, though it was not perfect, but it was not all that bad either. Our benchmarks for Sea of Thieves, average frame rate at 65.6 frames per second. Minimum frame rates hit 14.7 frames per second. Maximum frame rate hit 92.1 frames per second. Our 0.1% lows hit 1.6 frames per second. As the benchmarks show, the game runs pretty good, though the 0.1% lows showing 1.6 frames per second, which could be attributed to the island loading and the load lag. We also did experience a little load lag for new assets loading into the game. But at the end of the day, the 955 Black Edition with the GTX 660 Sea of Thieves is a definite playable game. Jumping off the plane into our next game, PUBG. PUBG is not the newest of titles these days. It was originally released as beta in early 2017, and its full release was not released until the much later part of the same year. This Battle Royale game, yet another fun multiplayer game to play with up to 4 of your best mates. We set the graphics res for PUBG at 1920 by 1080 at low settings. The game did suffer from load lag when you first jump off the plane and for a little moment during your descent to the ground. Once landed, the game gave us quite a smooth gaming experience. Yet again, this game did not run perfect, with an occasional load stutter, but still plays well enough that you could have an enjoyable game to play. Frame rates for PUBG, average frame rate was at 52.0 frames per second. Minimum frame rate hit 6.9 frames per second, which is kind of low. Maximum frame rate was 72.6 frames per second, and our 0.1% lows was 1.5 frames per second. The 0.1% lows, once again quite low, was basically a byproduct from our load starter during our gameplay. We generally found that the CPU was just hanging on, sitting fairly high in its utilization usage, and on the occasion maxing completely out at 100% on all 4 cores. We do wonder if an overclock could push this CPU just a bit further to give us a better, smoother gaming experience in this game. But overall, the gaming was good enough that we could say this is a playable but not perfect experience. Now for a newer title for the Offbits game list today. We have the 2016 title, Hitman. This game is a great immersive mission-based set around your player character, Agent 47. We had set this game at 1920 by 1080 at low settings. Hitman gave us not a 60 FPS experience, though for the part we played it ran quite fine, with a 40 FPS feel. Something similar to what a console would play like. The CPU did spend a lot of its time at 100% across all 4 cores, according to our benchmark software anyway, but this did not hinder how the game played. Frame rates for Hitman, average frame rate was 38.4 frames per second. Our minimum frame rate hit 26.5 frames per second. Maximum frame rates hit 49.9 frames per second. Our 0.1% lows hit a frame rate of 11.8 frames per second. And as the metrics from our benchmark software show, that this game did run pretty good, though not at high frame rates, with almost 12 frames per second on the 0.1% lows and minimum frame rates at 26.5 frames per second. This shows a fairly promising result, but little headroom for any missions that has lots of things going on. Optionally, we could down our resolution settings if this was a problem though, but for the part we played, this did not need to happen. So we are happy to say this game is playable, but be cautioned that you may need to drop the resolutions back if the world gets really busy. The last game we are playing today is Star Wars Battlefront 2. Battlefront 2 is a 2017 title and it plays pretty similar to your other Battlefield series games. There is also an early version of Battlefront 2 from 2005. This is not the version we are playing today. We played Star Wars Battlefront 2 with the settings of 1280 by 720 at low settings. Now the game played well enough, but I never felt attached with the aiming of the weapons. Now this may be because of the third person view and a mix of the 720p resolution. The CPU sat pretty much 100% across all 4 cores at all times. However, the game never gave us any problems with load lag or any major stutter issues. Once we had loaded everything up, everything played quite fine. The frame rates for Star Wars Battlefront 2, average frame rate was 46.7 frames per second. Minimum frame rates hit 17.5 frames per second. Our maximum frame rates hit 94.5 frames per second. Our 0.1% lows hit 1.9 frames per second. As you see, the game did not quite hit the 60 FPS for any long duration of time. We did suffer with some load lag and stutter, which was shown in the 0.1% lows. This game did not run perfect, but we could play it quite fine. Though I struggled to get the feel of a third person view at the 720p resolution, but you may have a different experience than I have. This game was playable, but we do feel that a faster CPU or an overclock could help this game out quite a lot. We did try a few other games for our test, but we could not get them to run on this setup. One of these games was Red Dead Redemption 2. Running Red Dead, it would crash us to desktop with no error information. This would happen when we tried to load into the world from inside the game. Another game was Cyberpunk 2077. This game did give us an error on launch. Now I'm sure there's probably a fix to get this to work out, but unfortunately due to a motherboard failure we had with our original build for this video, we ran out of time. So maybe next time we'll have a crack at that. Now wrapping this system up, the AMD Phenom 2 955 Black Edition, still a capable CPU able to run most of 2020 and 2021 titles, though with some exception. This is probably being due to non-supported instruction sets from the Phenom 2. We did find that the 955 Black Edition in most of the titles today were just basically hanging on. We do wonder if this CPU with a decent overclock would help iron out those slight load stutters that we did experience. Being a Black Edition CPU, this should be easily achieved, and something we may look into in a future feature video. The GTX 660, this video card still can pack a punch, though newer games need to be limited to lower settings, and some games will need resolutions lower than 1920 by 1080. GTX 660 cards in Australia can be found on the cheap, through second-hand sources like Facebook Marketplace. Though we're unsure how much newer titles that the GTX 660 will be able to run, but for now it still does alright. I guess we'll have to wait and see what the rest of 2021 is going to release. Well, that's all we got today for you at The Offbit. Thank you once again for watching. Just a friendly reminder to like this video if you liked it. Also, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. We are cultivating a friendly tech community for everyone, so come join us, and also don't forget to leave us a line in the comments. Thank you once again for watching, and we'll catch you next time on The Offbit.